Hello, I am Nicolas Arias, doctorate student in early childhood education at East Tennessee State University. This is my presentation about the books that I love. So let me share my screen with you to start. Okay. I call that presentation Books, Mentors, and Philosophies of My Life and My Literacy Approach. Um, the first step that I took is or the first point that I go into was the books that changed my life. The first one was 1984 by George Orwell. This particular one was about that literature work. Um, it is because I wasn't in a time very attracted by the dystopic literature, but when I find that it brings me an important perspective of the importance of our human cultural creations, the value that they have, the importance even, for example, from science that could be something that elevates us, but also something that could be used against us by the powers. So this is an important claim on what freedom is about, and mainly that freedom about the to tell the people what they don't want to hear, and this is important for the health of a democracy. And that's why this is a book that changed my life because it gives me perspectives on those topics and fitted me about the value of democracy. The second one is similar, but it's more a philosophical work and political and social philosophy. That is The Open Society and Its Enemies by the philosopher, the Austrian born and from New Zealand, Karl Popper, when he states in that book that the importance of the rationality, the importance of free judgment, and that they don't be limited by powers. And that's important and central for democracies also. And it prevents us to some views and also from some powers that are enemies of that way of thinking that say that that's why they are enemies of the open society, like the fundamentalism, mainly many religious fundamentalism, but fundamentalism from all kinds, and also about the authoritarian and totalitarian states and powers, and prevents us about us. The book was published right after the Second World War, but it's still very actual and very important even for our days. The third one was The Grasp of Consciousness by Jean Piaget. It is one of the many works by Jean Piaget, but that particular one is important, I think, because it analyzes the dynamics of our performance, how we begin to learn in that, how we begin to develop our ability, and how it becomes more conscious and more deliberate. And in that way is foundational, for example, for it opens me that interest in that point, in those points. And that's, for example, why it becomes also important for foundation for many fields that today are very important fields like metacognition, self-regulations, and executive function. Other text that changed my life is not a book, but it's an article called "Those Who Understand Knowledge Growth in Teaching." It's because, but his author, the American psychologist in Stanford, Lee Shulman, gives us a perspective about the complexities that are in the acts of teaching. And it drives my perspective on those complexities and the complexities on what do the good teachers, how complex could be teaching, and how the teachers learn that are part of my interest and part of my dissertation interest. Um, Other book that changed my life is a digital book in East Tennessee State University, made by authors that belong to early childhood education and elementary education in East Tennessee State. That is teaching early and elementary STEM, because I was interested in STEM, going into STEM, trying to figure out what is STEM education. And this book gave me an important perspective and with very rigorous foundations about what is STEM education in many different aspects. So that's why it is important, and that's because have an interest related with literacy and discursive language that is important also for my dissertation interest. So that's why it's a book that changed my life also. The second point, the quotes that define my philosophy of education and learning. In those points, I have different points that converge to the point that the importance of the own action and appropriation that each one does in learning. The first one is by John Dewey, the American philosopher, psychologist, political scientist, when he says in Experience and Education that the intensity of the desire measures the strength of the efforts that will be put forth. But wishes are empty castles in the air unless they are translated into the means by which they may be realized. Important, very important, because highlights the important that we can desire some things, and it is important because it gives us motivation. But we need to put that motivation into plans and actions in order to achieve different points or milestones that we need to overcome in order to do what we want to do, to be what we want to be. And that's why I consider that point of view very important. The second one is by Jean Piaget, and he said in that text that to understand is to invent the future of education in the short period when he was in the General Secretary of the UNESCO. And he faced in that time, he takes some distance from his background on child and developmental psychology and face more educational realms. And he said in that moment that a student who achieves a certain knowledge through free investigation and spontaneous effort will later be able to retain it. He will have acquired a methodology that can serve him from the rest of his life, which will stimulate his curiosity without the risk of exhausting it. The importance of our own-born curiosity, our own-born, own impulse in order to drive our learning through that. The third one was researcher, American researcher Clark Cameron. She works in a foundational skills like motor skills, spatial skills, and executive functions in early childhood education. In his work, Hands On, Minds On, she says that a combination of unstructured free play, adult guided activity, and individual and fine motor activities are associated with children's learning relatively more in multiple domains. Adult help focus children's attention on play with objects and encourage specific actions with those objects with potential benefit for executive functions, motor skills, and spatial skills. This is important because it highlights a perspective that doesn't let the children alone, just doing by themselves and with not much progress in that way, but also prevents us in just be too directive, too adult directive in our actions with them when we are in educational settings. and gives us an option that is that let them play, but giving them options and in some way suggesting some routes that they freely choose in order to build and construct their knowledge. The other one is Aidan Chambers, in the literacy realms. He's a British author, teacher, and teacher of teachers, teacher educator. And he says that in the reading environment, how adults help children enjoy books. My experience as a reader and as a teacher tells me that one of the answers lies in the kind of talk people do about the reading. Some kinds of talk because they cause us to think more carefully, more deeply about what we've read, have the effect of making us more aware of what is happening to us. And this in turn make us more discriminating in our selection. This is important because it gives the importance about when we are choosing text that we read them, and when we read and we have the opportunity to have conversation and talk with other people about that, gives us different perspectives, makes us to come back and maybe enrich our activity with text with those things. And I think that it works for literacy and works for many knowledge fields. And the other one is the Argentinian scholar Paula Carlino in her work about academic literacy, reading, writing, and learning in the university, when she says that the university is founded and grounded on reading and writing. It would be an absurdity if the university does not work with those abilities. And it calls us for the compromise on growing in literacy that is also for us, because we are in the university learning about new languages, about new ways to express in the academic way, in a scholar way and research way, from our particular fields and professional fields. And that's why that is important, because it highlights that literacy doesn't stop at some point. It's a lifelong learning, and it highlights that. Um, in the third point, research of philosophers, that my perspective on literacy, I have more than one because I have different points of view about that. One is Roman Jakobson, an American Russian linguist and scholar of language, when his notion of literariness that calls for what is specific from a text that is reading what is specific in their characteristics. And it is important because people, for example, who as exposed in literature, becomes conscious about characteristics of written language and how it's discursively constructed. And that's why maybe some research find that those people who are more exposed, that, for example, to literature, has more critical thinking, for example. The second one is Bruno Bettelheim. Bruno Bettelheim was an Austrian American child psychoanalyst and psychiatrist. Has an important work about what happens in children when they learn to read. And this is that learning should be meaningful. And it's meaningful because he says learning to read needs to represent our realities. When it represents our realities about, for example, what is said in the text, that is believable, that is related with our realities, with the good and bad that they have the potential to make us really grow in our literacy motivation, but also our literacy learning. And that's why it becomes an important perspective. Alexander Luria, we know him as a creator of functional neuropsychology and a member of the historic cultural psychology with Leigh Vygotsky leading. And he states that as that school recognizes, we are built through our social cultural practice and context where we participate, but we need to grow up in our ability to grasp what is given socially to us. And this gives also an approach, given being in that school, an approach also to the, for example, views like the Jean Piaget's views. And this is important, an important conclusion that he draws in one of his late texts about the language and consciousness. The other one is the Dutch scholar Adriana Bas. She has an extensive research program on shared reading, and she studied what happens with adult children and their interactions when they are in those shared reading situations. And she highlights us that what happens there is about reading language. They know about reading language features and characteristics, and they know also about oral language at the same time, complex oral language, given by because those situations evoke in us, for example, dialogue, for example, reflections about the realities that could be similar to what is said on text, about what could be next on the text, and what, for example, could be the relationship between different text parts and some inferences on those points. So she highlights us on how those situations are very construction and have a very important impact on children's lives and learning and literacy learning mainly. The other one is Milia Ferreiro, an Argentinian scholar that was educated under Jean Piaget guidance in her doctorate. And she says that children learn about literacy because they reconstruct their own thinking about what is our reading language. She highlights the importance of what children are thinking about reading language when they are learning to read and write, and that's why that's an important guidance. The other one is Annette Karmilov-Smith, British psychologist, developmental psychologist that studied with Jean Piaget and has an important theoretical work integrating Jean Piaget works and nativist perspectives in a new perspective that also fits from neuroscience. In that perspective, she talks about the play between automatizing some abilities and be more conscious and strategical in other ones in order to grow in our capacity and ability and to use that consciously and deliberate to do some actions and become and have some expertise on them. And it is extended maybe into literacy because, for example, as we saw in our text about the science of reading, the idea about the rope of the rope by Hollis Scarborough that states about some process in reading that become automatic and some process that become more strategical, maybe is based on that view. So that's why I consider that perspective it's an important philosophy in literacy realms. Um, Thank you. That's my presentation. Thank you for listening to me. And this is where I finish. Thank you so much.